Sophie Turner hurried down the busy streets of downtown Boston, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The weight of her medical textbooks in her backpack paled in comparison to the emotional burden she had been carrying for months. Adopted as a baby, Sophie had always wondered about her biological parents, but only recently had she stumbled upon a truth that had shaken her to her core. Her biological father was none other than Dr. Richard Donovan, the internationally renowned cardiac surgeon. Her fingers gripped the coffee cup tighter as she recalled the day she found out. A routine DNA test as part of her genetics class had led to an unexpected match in the system. The result was there in black and white. Her father was the same man whose lectures she had admired from afar, the man whose success stories were written about in medical journals. But now, standing just blocks from the Donovan family mansion where she worked as a babysitter, Sophie felt a deep unease. She wasn't there as his daughter. Not yet. She was just Sophie, the babysitter. It had been a calculated move. When she saw an ad looking for a live-in babysitter for the Donovan family, she had applied without hesitation, deciding it was the best way to approach Richard without overwhelming him with the truth. Her mind churned with the thought of meeting her biological father every single day without him knowing who she truly was. A part of her feared how he would react when he found out, but the other part, a growing part, felt anger. Anger that she had been given away, that Richard had never looked for her. The Donovan mansion was imposing, with its tall gates and perfectly manicured lawns, a stark contrast to Sophie's modest apartment and the life she had known. As she entered through the side door, Sophie was met with the sound of Grace Donovan's heels clicking on the marble floors. Grace, Richard's wife, was an elegant, commanding presence. Sophie had felt Grace's cold eyes on her more than once, always assessing, always judging. Sophie knew she wasn't welcome here, not really. "Good morning, Sophie," Grace said, her voice clipped. Her gaze traveled up and down Sophie's clothes, an almost imperceptible sneer forming. "Running late again? Are we? Try to be more punctual next time." Sophie forced a smile. "Of course, Mrs. Donovan. I'll make sure to do better." The tension in the air between them was palpable, and Sophie knew Grace saw her as nothing more than hired help. Sophie bit her tongue, trying to keep her cool. But what gnawed at her was the thought that Grace had no idea who she really was. The wife of the man who had given her up. The mother of a child she could have been. As she made her way upstairs to the nursery to care for the Donovans' young son, little Daniel, Sophie's heart raced with the secret she carried. Every day in this house felt like walking on the edge of a knife. She had come here to learn more about Richard, to see if she could fit into this family that had lived without her. But the more time she spent here, the more Sophie realized how little she knew about what she truly wanted. Was it a relationship with her father? Or was it simply closure? She paused at the door of the nursery, watching Daniel play quietly with his toys. A soft smile spread across her face. For now, she would do her job and take care of him. The rest, the confrontation with Richard, could wait. But for how long? That question haunted her every move. Sophie stood quietly in the nursery, watching little Daniel Donovan, a bright-eyed boy with curly brown hair, completely absorbed in building a tower of wooden blocks. The soft click of each block falling into place provided a rhythm, a brief escape from the whirlwind of thoughts in Sophie's head. She kneeled beside him, her presence going unnoticed as he concentrated. But Sophie wasn't really focused on Daniel. Her thoughts drifted downstairs, to the people she was growing more curious about every day. Richard Donovan, her biological father, had no idea that the young woman quietly taking care of his son was his own flesh and blood. And Grace, his wife, so elegant, so poised, yet cold as ice, seemed to sense something, even if she couldn't yet put her finger on it. Sophie was trying to stay under the radar, but it was getting harder. "Daniel, do you want to go outside later? Maybe to the park?" she asked, hoping to fill the awkward silence that often lingered in this house. The boy didn't look up. "Maybe later," he mumbled, focused on his tower. Just then, the sound of footsteps approached the door, light but deliberate. Grace appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as they landed on Sophie. Even in a simple cardigan, Grace carried an air of superiority that made Sophie feel instantly inferior. like a stain on the pristine carpet. "Sophie," Grace began, her tone even but laced with something sharp. "After you're done with Daniel, I'd like to have a word with you." Sophie's stomach tightened. "Of course, Mrs. Donovan." With a small nod, Grace turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving Sophie standing in the wake of her disapproving presence. This wasn't the first time Grace had called her for a private chat, and every time Sophie left feeling smaller, her confidence chipped away. "Why does she hate me?" Sophie whispered to herself, but she already knew the answer. She wasn't part of their world, not in Grace's eyes. And if Grace knew the truth, if she ever found out Sophie's real identity, it would all come crashing down. But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that Grace suspected something. There was always this look she gave Sophie, a mix of disdain and distrust. After settling Daniel with his afternoon snack, Sophie hesitated at the top of the stairs. She could hear Grace talking to someone, her voice low but tense. As she slowly descended, Sophie saw Grace standing in the kitchen with her back turned, phone pressed to her ear. "I don't trust her," Grace said, her voice strained. "I don't know why, but I get this feeling that she's hiding something. There's something off about her, Richard. You don't see it, but I do." Sophie froze mid-step. Grace was talking about her. She could feel her pulse quickening, a lump forming in her throat. There was a pause, and Grace let out a frustrated sigh. "No, I know she's just the babysitter, but—" Grace turned, and Sophie's heart stopped as their eyes met. There was a brief moment of silence, an intense pause, before Grace abruptly ended the call. "I'll talk to you later," she said into the phone before hanging up. "Are you eavesdropping?" Grace asked, her tone sharp. Sophie quickly shook her head. "No, I was just coming down. You said you wanted to talk to me." Grace stepped forward, her gaze piercing. For a moment, Sophie thought Grace might say something about the phone call, but instead, Grace's eyes flickered with something more hostile. "I've been meaning to ask you, Sophie, how do you plan to balance your studies and this job? I know medical school isn't easy, and frankly, I don't see how someone like you manages to afford it." There it was again, that jab, the subtle but stinging reminder of their differences. Grace didn't outright say it, but Sophie felt the weight of the implication. "Someone like you." Sophie's throat tightened, but she forced a smile. "I've been managing just fine, Mrs. Donovan." "Good," Grace replied, her voice dripping with indifference. "Because Daniel needs consistency. If you're going to be here, you need to be fully committed. We don't need distractions." Sophie could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. Distractions? Was that what she was? The outsider, the one who didn't belong in this pristine world of wealth and status? The babysitter with a secret no one could ever know? As Grace walked past her, the coldness in the air seemed to follow, leaving Sophie standing there, feeling more like an intruder in this house than ever before. That night, after Daniel was asleep and the Donovan house had grown quiet, Sophie sat by the window in her small guest room. She stared out into the vast, manicured backyard, her mind racing. Her mother had passed away when she was young, taking with her any answers about why Sophie had been given up for adoption. Now, the only person who could provide answers was living just downstairs. Richard Donovan, her father. But Sophie couldn't just blurt it out. "Hey, guess what? I'm your long-lost daughter." No, it had to be more careful than that, more planned. But how much longer could she wait? As she sat in the darkness, the weight of her secret felt heavier than ever. The tension in the Donovan household was growing, and Sophie knew that one way or another, the truth was bound to come out. She just didn't know if it would break her or set her free. The days passed in a blur of routine and mounting tension. Sophie continued her role in the Donovan household, caring for Daniel, running small errands, and keeping her distance whenever Grace was around. The walls of the grand house seemed to close in on her more and more each day, and her secret, the truth about her connection to Richard Donovan, felt like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for the moment to explode. One late afternoon, Sophie stood by the kitchen sink, washing Daniel's snack dishes when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Richard. She had learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps, calm, deliberate, and always carrying a certain authority. Her heart skipped a beat. "How are you settling in, Sophie?" Richard's deep voice asked from behind her. Sophie turned, meeting his kind eyes for just a moment before quickly looking away. "I'm doing well, Dr. Donovan. Thank you." He nodded, walking over to the counter where a stack of medical journals sat waiting for him. There was an easy confidence in his movements, the kind of confidence that came from years of being respected, of knowing you were the best in your field. For a moment, Sophie allowed herself to just look at him. The broad shoulders, the graying hair at his temples, the sharp but kind features. He didn't look like a man burdened by secrets, certainly not the secret of having a daughter he didn't know about. He had a warm smile that he flashed often, but there was also an air of distance about him. Sophie had seen him in action at the hospital once, during one of her clinical rotations. He was a legend there, unflappable, brilliant. And yet, as he stood there now, leafing through a journal, he was just Richard Donovan, the man who had unknowingly fathered her. "Daniel seems to really like you," Richard continued, not looking up from the pages. Sophie's breath caught for a second. Every time he spoke to her, every casual remark, every small interaction, it chipped away at the wall she was trying so hard to maintain. "He's a great kid," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Richard looked up, his gaze softening as he leaned against the counter. "You're studying to be a doctor, right?" "Yes," Sophie replied, feeling the familiar mix of pride and anxiety rise in her chest. "That's quite the commitment," he said, admiration in his tone. "It takes a lot of determination to get through medical school." Sophie nodded, unsure of how to respond. If only he knew. If only he understood how much of that determination came from wanting to be closer to him, from wanting to understand the world he came from. She had chosen medicine not just because she loved it, but because, in some strange way, it felt like a connection to him. "You remind me a little of myself at your age," Richard continued, his smile widening just a bit. Sophie's heart lurched. For a moment, she wanted to scream out the truth, to tell him that they were more alike than he could ever imagine. But she bit her lip, nodding instead. "I guess I just have a lot to prove," she said quietly. Richard chuckled. "Don't we all?" Before the conversation could go any further, Grace appeared in the doorway, her presence instantly chilling the room. Sophie immediately tensed. Grace's sharp eyes flicked between Richard and Sophie, and though she smiled at her husband, there was something cold beneath it, something that made Sophie's stomach churn. "Richard, darling, don't forget we have dinner with the Albrights tonight," Grace reminded him, her voice sweet but laced with impatience. Richard nodded, snapping the journal shut. "Of course. I'll be ready in a few minutes." As Richard left the kitchen, Grace's gaze lingered on Sophie for just a second too long, the smile on her lips not quite reaching her eyes. Sophie could feel the tension building, a silent battle of wills between them. Grace never missed an opportunity to remind Sophie of her place in this house. Beneath them, unworthy. It was in every glance, every dismissive remark. "Sophie," Grace finally said, her voice as smooth as glass but as sharp as a blade, "I trust you've taken care of everything for tonight?" Sophie nodded, trying to mask her discomfort. "Yes, Mrs. Donovan. Daniel's all set for the evening." "Good," Grace said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "We wouldn't want any distractions." Sophie didn't miss the subtle insult, but she didn't let it show. She had gotten good at swallowing the sharp words Grace sent her way. After Grace left, Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Alone again in the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, her mind racing. It was always like this with Grace, a battle Sophie wasn't even sure she was fighting anymore. It felt more like survival. She couldn't let Grace get to her, not when she was so close to revealing the truth about Richard. Later that night, after the Donovans had left for their dinner, the house grew eerily quiet. Sophie sat by the fire in the living room, her eyes staring into the flames as they flickered and danced. She had been avoiding thinking about it all evening, but now, with nothing but silence around her, the question burned in her mind. How much longer could she keep this secret? She thought about her mother, about the life she had lived without ever knowing who her father really was. And now that Sophie had the answer, it felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on her chest every second she was in this house. The truth was bound to come out eventually. But how? Would it be Sophie who revealed it, or would Grace, with her sharp instincts, figure it out first? Sophie had seen the way Grace watched her, the calculating glances that seemed to suggest she suspected something was off. Sophie's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. It was a text from a friend, another medical student. "How's babysitting for the famous surgeon? You should totally ask him to help us with our clinicals, Al." Sophie stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the keys, unsure of how to respond. Babysitting for her biological father wasn't exactly something she could joke about. Instead, she locked the phone and stared back into the fire, her mind heavy with thoughts of what was to come. The truth was a storm on the horizon, and Sophie knew she couldn't avoid it forever. The early morning light filtered through the large bay windows of the Donovan mansion, casting a golden glow over the pristine kitchen as Sophie prepared breakfast for Daniel. She moved carefully, her hands occupied but her mind far away. It had been a restless night, haunted by dreams where the truth slipped out uncontrollably, where Richard and Grace found out everything in the worst way possible. She had woken up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. "Morning, Sophie." Richard's voice broke her thoughts as he stepped into the kitchen, casually adjusting his cufflinks. He had an important surgery that morning, and his demeanor was, as always, calm and collected. Sophie admired that about him. The way he never seemed flustered, no matter what pressures surrounded him. She wondered if that was a trait she had inherited from him, or if her anxiety was solely her own. "Good morning, Dr. Donovan," she replied with a smile, though the unease from her dream lingered. She focused on preparing Daniel's breakfast, but her attention kept drifting toward Richard. He sat at the breakfast table, thumbing through the morning paper, his brow furrowed in thought. "Anything interesting today?" Sophie asked, trying to fill the quiet with something normal, something that didn't revolve around the secret she carried. Richard didn't look up but responded with a distracted hum. "Just the usual. Politics, market fluctuations, same old stories." Sophie nodded, grateful for the small talk. But just as she set Daniel's cereal down, she felt the atmosphere shift. The clicking of high heels announced Grace's presence before she even entered the room. Her arrival was always like that, a subtle change in the air, like the temperature had dropped just a little. Sophie stiffened immediately, bracing herself. Grace entered, her perfectly styled hair framing her face, not a strand out of place. She was dressed in a crisp white blouse and tailored pants, exuding the effortless grace that made her so intimidating. Her sharp eyes landed on Sophie almost instantly, narrowing ever so slightly as if she were already searching for something to criticize. "Good morning," Grace said, her voice soft but with an edge that Sophie could always hear. It was the tone of someone who knew they held all the power in the room. "Good morning, Mrs. Donovan," Sophie replied, her own voice careful, neutral. Grace moved around the kitchen with a silent authority, pouring herself a cup of coffee, but Sophie could feel those eyes on her again. It was like Grace was dissecting her, peeling back layers, trying to find what was out of place. There had been something unspoken between them ever since Sophie had started working there, and now it seemed as if Grace's suspicions were growing. "You've been here for quite some time now, haven't you, Sophie?" Grace's question came out casually, but there was a bite underneath. Sophie paused, her heart skipping a beat, but she forced herself to answer steadily. "Yes, it's been a few months." Grace smiled, but it wasn't warm. "Time flies. Richard was just saying how good you've been with Daniel." Her gaze flicked to Richard, who offered a small nod, unaware of the tension building. "She's been wonderful," Richard confirmed absent-mindedly as he folded his newspaper and rose from the table. "You have a good way with him, Sophie." "Thank you," Sophie said quietly, though the compliment made her feel uneasy. Richard had no idea just how good their connection truly was, and every kind word felt like a knife twisting deeper into the lie she was living. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee slowly. "Tell me, Sophie, what exactly do your parents do?" The question was like a strike from nowhere, and Sophie froze for a split second. She had rehearsed this answer 100 times in her mind. "My parents, they're not in medicine," she began carefully, trying to keep her tone even. My dad passed away when I was little. My mom, she worked in education. The half-truths tasted bitter on her tongue. I see, Grace said, her gaze lingering on Sophie. You must be very independent then. Yes, Sophie replied, though the pressure building inside her made it hard to breathe. She could feel Grace trying to dig deeper, like a predator sensing weakness. Grace knew how to push, how to make people squirm without ever raising her voice. There was something about Sophie that had been gnawing at Grace since day one, and Sophie could feel her circling ever closer to the truth. Just as the tension seemed unbearable, Richard stepped in, oblivious to the undercurrent between the two women. I should get going. Big day ahead at the hospital. He leaned over to kiss Grace's cheek, and with a final nod to Sophie, he left the kitchen. Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but the reprieve was short-lived. As soon as Richard was gone, Grace's eyes settled back on her, colder and sharper than ever. You know, Sophie, you've done a good job here, Grace said, her voice smooth as silk. But I've noticed something odd. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, their weight pressing down on Sophie. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something about you. Something that doesn't add up. Sophie's stomach dropped. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind was racing. Did Grace know? Was she just fishing for a reaction? Or was this another one of Grace's subtle mind games, designed to make her feel small and out of place? I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Donovan, Sophie said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct told her to look away. Grace's smile widened just slightly, but it didn't reach her eyes. Oh, I'm sure you don't. She set her coffee cup down and turned toward the doorway, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Before leaving, she glanced over her shoulder, her voice taking on a final, ominous note. But don't worry, Sophie. I always figure things out eventually. The words echoed in Sophie's mind long after Grace had left the room. Her hands trembled as she picked up the dish towel, gripping it tightly as if it could somehow stop the flood of anxiety rushing through her. Grace was onto her. Maybe she didn't know the full truth yet, but she was too smart, too perceptive. Sooner or later, she would piece it all together. Sophie leaned against the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. The walls of the Donovan mansion suddenly felt too close, the air too heavy. She had thought she could keep her secret hidden, at least until she was ready to reveal it. But Grace's growing suspicion made it clear that time was running out. Later that night, after Daniel had been put to bed, Sophie sat in her small guest room, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her fingers traced the edge of the small locket around her neck, a keepsake from her adoptive mother, one of the few things that tied her to her old life. She opened it, revealing the tiny photograph of her as a baby, cradled in the arms of her adoptive mother. In her mind, she pictured Richard holding her like that, just once, when she was born. She had no memories of him, no evidence that he had ever been a part of her life, and yet, here she was, living under his roof, connected to him in ways no one knew. Except Grace, it seemed, was beginning to suspect. Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her secret crushing down on her more than ever. She had thought she could control when the truth would come out, but now, it was slipping through her fingers. The storm was coming, and Sophie had no idea how to prepare for it. The Donovan household buzzed with activity, as it rarely did. The grand dining room, usually quiet and serene, had been transformed into a scene of elegance and luxury for the evening's gala. Staff moved swiftly through the rooms, setting silverware, placing elaborate floral arrangements, and ensuring that everything was perfect for the prestigious event. Richard and Grace had invited colleagues, influential friends, and hospital board members for an elegant dinner, a display of wealth, status, and power. Sophie stood at the edge of the dining room, watching as the finishing touches were placed. Her job for the night was simple: stay in the background, take care of Daniel, and be invisible. But the heavy weight of her secret made it hard to focus on anything. Grace's suspicions had been growing stronger by the day, and Sophie could feel them suffocating her. Tonight, in a house full of strangers, the tension seemed to swell, almost unbearable. As she adjusted her simple black dress, she heard Grace's voice, sharp and demanding, drift from the hallway. Sophie tensed automatically. expecting yet another subtle jab, but this time Grace's ire was directed at the household staff. "Everything needs to be flawless," Grace instructed one of the caterers, her tone cold and controlled. "We cannot afford any slip-ups tonight." Sophie busied herself with making sure Daniel was dressed and ready for bed. He was more energetic than usual, probably sensing the buzz of activity around the house. She helped him into his pajamas and read him a short story before tucking him in. Daniel drifted off easily, his soft breathing filling the quiet nursery as Sophie dimmed the lights. The gala was in full swing by the time Sophie slipped downstairs. As she passed through the hallway, she could hear snippets of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of classical music playing in the background. The guests were gathered in the dining room, seated around the long mahogany table, sipping wine and enjoying polite conversation. Richard, always the gracious host, was deep in discussion with one of his hospital colleagues, his booming laughter filling the room. He looked completely at ease in this world. His world. Sophie lingered just outside the dining room, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. She shouldn't have stayed so close, but curiosity kept her rooted in place. She wasn't supposed to be part of this life, not officially, but a part of her was desperate to feel connected to it, even for a brief moment. Grace, seated at the head of the table next to Richard, was the perfect picture of poise and grace. She held court effortlessly, engaging with their guests, her smile never faltering. But when her gaze landed on Sophie standing by the door, something in her eyes flickered, an intensity, a challenge. "Ah, Sophie," Grace said, her voice cutting through the chatter as the room fell uncomfortably silent. All eyes turned towards Sophie, who felt a sudden flush of panic. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be invisible tonight. "Come in," Grace continued, her tone too sweet, almost mocking. "Why don't you join us for a moment?" Sophie hesitated, her pulse quickening. What was Grace playing at? I'm just making sure everything's going smoothly," Sophie replied, forcing a polite smile, hoping that would be enough to let her slip back into the shadows. "Nonsense," Grace said, her smile widening, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's always good to see the people who help us make our home functional." There was a murmur of amusement from the guests, but Sophie could feel the sharpness beneath Grace's words, the subtle way she was being made an example of. She was the help. She didn't belong at this table, among these people. Richard glanced up, his expression one of mild confusion. He hadn't expected this either, but he remained silent, watching the scene unfold. "You've been with us for a while now, haven't you?" Grace asked, her voice turning conversational, but Sophie could sense the trap hidden beneath the question. "Yes, Mrs. Donovan," Sophie answered carefully. "A few months. Is that so?" Grace's smile grew tighter, and then she turned to the guests. "You know, Sophie here is studying to be a doctor. Isn't that wonderful? Balancing med school with taking care of Daniel. Quite impressive." There was polite nodding from the guests, but Sophie could feel their disinterest. They didn't care about the babysitter's aspirations. But Grace wasn't finished. "Tell us, Sophie," Grace said, her voice dripping with condescension. "What made you choose our family to work for?" Sophie felt her throat tighten, her hands trembling at her sides. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, waiting for an answer, and she could sense Grace's real question hiding beneath the surface. It wasn't about the job. It was about Sophie's presence here, about why she had inserted herself into their lives. I applied because I needed the work while I'm studying," Sophie stammered, trying to keep her composure. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Sophie thought she might push further. But instead, Grace's expression shifted, turning icy. "Of course," she said, her tone dismissive. "Well, we do appreciate your service." Sophie nodded quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped back toward the door, ready to retreat to the safety of the kitchen, but Grace's voice cut through the air once more. "Oh, Sophie, before you go," Grace called out, stopping her in her tracks. "There's just one more thing." Sophie turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "Don't you ever wonder about your real family?" Grace asked, her voice soft but laced with venom. The room fell deathly silent. The guests looked confused, and Richard's brows furrowed in sudden concern, his gaze snapping between Grace and Sophie. Sophie's blood ran cold. She felt the floor shift beneath her, the words hitting her like a physical blow. For a split second, she thought Grace might know everything, about Richard, about the connection. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain calm. "My real family?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Grace's smile was cruel now, a predator toying with its prey. "Yes, you know, the one you're really from. We all come from somewhere, don't we?" Sophie stared at Grace, her heart hammering in her chest, trying to hold herself together. The unspoken meaning was clear. Grace was reminding Sophie of her place, of the fact that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't one of them. And yet, Sophie could see it in Grace's eyes. There was more than just cruelty here. There was suspicion, a dangerous, simmering suspicion. Richard looked between the two women, clearly uncomfortable now. "Grace, I think that's enough," he said, his voice firm but confused. Sophie could barely hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat. The secret she had tried so hard to keep was unraveling, right in front of these strangers, and she couldn't stop it. Grace had gotten too close. Without another word, Sophie turned and walked out of the dining room, her vision blurry with panic. She hurried up the stairs, retreating to her small guest room, where she collapsed onto the bed, her chest tight with fear. The truth was boiling to the surface, and now, with Grace's suspicions out in the open, it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Sophie sat in her room, trembling. The soft glow from the bedside lamp did little to ease the storm raging inside her. The air felt thick with tension, suffocating, as her thoughts spun in chaotic loops. Grace's words from the gala still echoed in her mind. Sharp, pointed, cruel. "Don't you ever wonder about your real family?" It had been more than just an insult. It was a warning. Grace knew, or at least, she was dangerously close to knowing the truth. The weight of everything Sophie had been hiding for months now felt unbearable. She had thought she could control when and how the truth would come out, but that possibility was slipping through her fingers. Grace was too sharp, too calculating. The woman didn't need evidence. She could sense the secrets bubbling beneath the surface. Sophie's breath quickened as she sat up, her hands shaking. She needed to do something. But what? Confront Grace? Confess everything to Richard? The thought of revealing her secret, of telling Richard that she was his daughter, made her stomach turn with fear. What if he didn't believe her? What if Grace used it against her? What if it destroyed everything? A knock at the door startled Sophie out of her spiraling thoughts. Her heart skipped, panic immediately setting in. Was it Grace, come to push her further, to tear away the last shreds of her composure? But when she opened the door, it was Richard who stood there, his face marked with concern. "Sophie," he said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the chaos inside her mind. "Can we talk?" Sophie froze, a dozen emotions fighting for control. Her instincts told her to run, to hide, but instead, she nodded, stepping aside to let Richard in. He entered the room, his presence suddenly feeling much larger than before. The tension was palpable, like the air between them was charged with the truth neither of them had yet spoken. Richard sat down in the chair by the window, glancing around the modest room. He seemed out of place here, a man of wealth and stature, now sitting in this small, unassuming space. Sophie stood by the bed, unsure of what to do with her hands, her pulse racing. "I'm sorry about what happened downstairs," Richard began, his tone kind but measured. "Grace, she can be difficult sometimes." Sophie said nothing. She couldn't bring herself to speak, knowing that anything she said now would come out shaky and uncertain. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes softening. "She didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. That's just, well, that's her way sometimes." Sophie nodded, biting her lip to keep from saying something she would regret. Grace hadn't just been difficult. She had been cruel, purposeful in her attack, and Sophie knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Grace wanted her gone. Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair, the weight of his own thoughts heavy on his shoulders. "You've been working here for a while now, Sophie, and I've noticed you've become a part of Daniel's life. A part of this house. Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the shift in his tone. There was something deeper in his voice now, something almost vulnerable. Richard paused, his eyes locking onto hers. I don't know why, but I feel like there's something more you're not telling me. Her heart stopped. The words hung in the air, freezing the moment in place. There it was, the opening, the door to the truth, cracked just wide enough for her to walk through, if she dared. But Sophie felt her throat tighten, the fear of rejection, of being cast out, rising like bile. Richard's gaze softened. You can trust me, he said quietly. If something's bothering you, you can tell me. Whatever it is. Sophie could feel the tears burning behind her eyes. She had held onto this secret for so long, had carried the weight of it alone. But now, faced with the opportunity to finally say it, she felt paralyzed. Her mind raced. What would he think? What would he say? But before she could gather the courage to speak, a voice came from the hallway, shattering the moment. Richard. It was Grace. Her voice was calm, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. She appeared in the doorway, her eyes flicking between Richard and Sophie, assessing the situation immediately. What's going on? Grace asked, her tone soft but loaded with suspicion. The way she looked at Sophie made it clear she hadn't forgotten what had transpired downstairs. Richard stood up, smoothing out his jacket. Nothing, Grace. I was just checking in with Sophie after the dinner. Grace's smile was tight. Of course. I'm sure Sophie appreciates your concern. Her eyes shifted to Sophie, narrowing ever so slightly. But don't you think it's getting a bit late? Sophie swallowed hard, feeling the temperature in the room drop. She wanted to speak, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. Richard, sensing the tension, stepped forward. Grace, But Grace cut him off with a wave of her hand. It's fine, Richard. I'll take care of it. Her gaze never left Sophie. Richard hesitated, then nodded, turning to Sophie with a small, apologetic smile. We'll talk later, Sophie. He left the room, leaving the two women alone. Grace closed the door behind him, the click of the latch loud in the silence that followed. Sophie's heart raced as Grace stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, the sound sending a shiver down Sophie's spine. You know, Grace began, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. Richard may be kind-hearted, but he's not a fool. He's starting to wonder. He's starting to ask questions. Sophie's stomach dropped. I've watched you, Sophie, Grace continued, her tone sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Since the day you arrived, you've been walking around this house like you belong here. Like you're one of us. Sophie felt her throat tighten, the fear rising like a wave she couldn't control. But you're not, Grace said, her voice cold and certain. She took another step forward, her eyes boring into Sophie's. I don't know what you're hiding, but I will find out. Sophie opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She could feel the tears welling up, the pressure of it all finally breaking through. Her entire body trembled with the weight of the secret she had tried so hard to protect. Grace smiled, satisfied with the fear she had instilled. You don't belong here, Sophie. And soon, everyone will know it. Sophie couldn't hold it back any longer. The tears slipped down her cheeks as her lips trembled. I am his daughter, she blurted out, her voice barely a whisper, but it felt like a scream. Grace froze, her eyes widening in shock. For the first time, the mask of control cracked. Sophie stood there, breathing hard, the truth finally out in the open, raw and vulnerable. I'm Richard's daughter, Sophie repeated, her voice breaking. I was given up for adoption when I was a baby, and I found out. I came here because I needed to know him. Grace stood there, stunned, her face pale as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, neither of them moved, both women caught in the wreckage of the revelation. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she braced for what was to come next. Grace's expression darkened, and she took a step back, her shock slowly morphing into something far more dangerous. Richard will never accept this, Grace whispered, her voice shaking with fury. He'll never accept you. The storm had finally broken, and there was no going back. The room felt like it had shrunk, the walls pressing in on Sophie as Grace's words hung in the air. "He'll never accept you." Sophie could barely breathe, her chest tightening under the weight of what she had just done. The secret she had carried so carefully, the truth that had defined her every move for months, was now out in the open, and she had no idea what would happen next. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the room, her face pale, her composure shattered. Her sharp, calculating demeanor was gone, replaced by something raw and dangerous. Sophie could see the fury brewing behind Grace's wide eyes, the kind of fury that didn't explode outward but simmered quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You can't be serious," Grace finally said, her voice low and trembling with restrained anger. She took a step towards Sophie, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You think you can just walk into this house and claim to be his daughter? After all these years?" Sophie took a step back, instinctively distancing herself from Grace's fury. Her heart was pounding, her body trembling with the adrenaline that surged through her. She hadn't planned for the truth to come out like this, certainly not in a confrontation with Grace, of all people. But now that it was out, there was no way to take it back. "It's the truth," Sophie said quietly, her voice shaking but firm. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't come here to ruin anyone's life. But Richard is my father." Grace's eyes blazed with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "Your father? Your father?" she spat, the words dripping with venom. "Richard doesn't even know you exist. He never has. He gave you up. You don't belong here." Sophie felt a fresh wave of pain at Grace's words, but she held her ground. "I deserve to know him. I deserve to know where I come from," she said, her voice firmer now. "This isn't about you or about what you want, Grace. This is about me finding my place in my own life." Grace's face twisted with anger, and for a moment, Sophie thought she might strike out physically. But instead, Grace let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You naive little girl," she said through clenched teeth. "Do you really think Richard will just welcome you with open arms? After all these years? After everything we've built together?" Sophie swallowed hard, her heart heavy with doubt. She didn't know how Richard would react, whether he would be horrified, angry, or even refuse to believe her. But the thought of walking away now, after coming this far, was unbearable. "I don't know how he'll react," Sophie admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "But I need to tell him. He deserves to know the truth. And so do I." Grace stepped closer, her face inches from Sophie's, her breath cold against Sophie's skin. "If you tell him," Grace hissed, "it will destroy everything. Our life, his career, you. Do you understand that? Richard's world doesn't have room for you. It never has, and it never will." Sophie flinched, but she didn't back down. "That's not your decision to make." There was a long, heavy silence between them. The tension in the room was suffocating, as if the air itself had turned thick with hostility. Grace's chest rose and fell with deep, angry breaths, her mind clearly racing to find a way to regain control. She wasn't just angry, she was afraid. Sophie could see it now. Grace's fear wasn't about Sophie's existence. It was about losing everything she had fought to protect. "You're making a huge mistake," Grace said finally, her voice cold and steely. "But if you insist on going down this path, don't say I didn't warn you." Sophie's heart clenched with fear, but she nodded. "I have to do this." Grace's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Then I'll watch you destroy yourself." With that, Grace turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway like gunshots. Sophie was left standing in the middle of the room, her breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. Her legs felt weak, and she had to sit down on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. The weight of what had just happened crashed down on her like a tidal wave. Grace knew the truth now, and she wasn't going to let it go easily. Sophie had expected resistance, but she hadn't been prepared for this level of venom, this level of malice. Grace was dangerous. Sophie could feel it in her bones. The woman wouldn't stop until she had completely erased Sophie from their lives. But Sophie couldn't back down now. She couldn't let fear, or Grace's threats, stop her from telling Richard the truth. She had come too far for that. The next morning, the Donovan mansion was eerily quiet. Sophie moved through the house cautiously, her heart in her throat, every sound setting her on edge. She hadn't seen Grace since their confrontation the night before, and the absence of her presence felt like a looming shadow, waiting to pounce. But Sophie wasn't looking for Grace today. She was looking for Richard. She found him in his study, seated at his large oak desk, papers spread out before him. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a golden glow over the room, but it did little to ease Sophie's nerves. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped inside, feeling like she was walking into a battlefield. "Dr. Donovan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard looked up from his work, his expression softening when he saw her. "Sophie, come in." Sophie took a deep breath, stepping further into the room. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced herself to stand tall. This was it, the moment she had been both dreading and longing for since the day she stepped foot into the Donovan house. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "It's important." Richard set his pen down, leaning back in his chair, his brow furrowing in concern. "Of course. What's going on?" Sophie hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the moment crashing over her. She could feel the weight of Grace's warning hanging over her like a dark cloud, but she couldn't turn back now. She had to tell him. "I don't know how to say this," Sophie began, her voice trembling slightly, "but there's something you need to know about me. About why I came here." Richard's concern deepened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Go on." Sophie swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Her hands shook as she wrung them together, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But then she looked into Richard's eyes, those eyes that were so familiar, so much like her own, and she found the strength she needed. "Richard," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I'm your daughter." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Richard stared at her, his expression frozen in shock, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm your daughter," Sophie repeated, her voice stronger now. "I was adopted when I was a baby, but I found out the truth a few months ago. I came here because I needed to know you." Richard's face went pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stood up slowly, shaking his head as if trying to process what she was saying. That's impossible," he stammered, his voice hoarse. I never knew." Sophie took a step closer, her heart aching for him. "You didn't know, but it's the truth. I'm your daughter." Richard stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the desk for support. He looked at her with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, something Sophie couldn't quite place. He was trying to piece it all together, trying to understand how this could have happened. "I didn't know," he whispered again, his voice filled with pain. "I didn't know." The truth was out now, raw and exposed, and there was no going back. Richard stood motionless, his breath shallow, his face pale as if the very foundation of his life had just been pulled from beneath him. Sophie watched him, her own heart breaking as she saw the disbelief and pain clouding his features. The words between them hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. "I'm your daughter." The echo of that revelation seemed to reverberate through the walls of the study, through the years of secrets and unknowns that Sophie had finally shattered. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt too small, the silence too loud. Richard sank slowly into the leather chair behind him, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the floor, still struggling to comprehend what had just been said. Sophie stood frozen, her own emotions swirling. Relief that the truth was finally out, but also a deep fear of what came next. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice barely a whisper, raw and trembling. How is this possible?" Sophie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This was the moment she had dreaded, the moment she had to explain everything, to put words to the pain and confusion she had carried for so long. I didn't know either, Sophie began, her voice soft but clear. Not until a few months ago. She hesitated, feeling the emotion rising in her throat, but she pushed through. I found out through a DNA test, part of a class I was taking in medical school. I wasn't looking for it, but the results came back, and your name was there. I started looking into it, and I found out the truth. That you're my biological father. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the floor, his face still pale, his breathing uneven. I had no idea, he murmured, more to himself than to Sophie. I never knew that you existed. Sophie's heart ached at the sight of him. This man she had admired from afar, now looking so lost, so broken. I wasn't sure if I should even tell you, she continued, her voice shaking. But I couldn't. I couldn't just stay silent. I had to know who you were. I had to know why. Richard's head snapped up at that, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time since she had revealed the truth. Why what? Sophie swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. Why you gave me up, she said quietly. Why you never looked for me. Richard's face twisted in agony, and he leaned forward, burying his head in his hands. Sophie felt a lump form in her throat as she watched him struggle with the weight of the past. His past, her past, and the terrible gap between them. I didn't, Richard began, his voice muffled. He looked up, his eyes filled with a deep, gut-wrenching sadness. I didn't give you up, Sophie. I never knew. I never knew about you. Sophie blinked, confusion washing over her. What do you mean? Richard took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he raked them through his hair. It was your mother, he said, his voice breaking. I didn't know she was pregnant. We were young. We had been together briefly, but then things ended. She moved away, and I never heard from her again. His voice cracked as he continued. If I had known, Sophie, if I had known you existed, I would never have left you. I swear. Sophie felt her legs go weak, and she sat down in the chair across from Richard, trying to process his words. He hadn't known. All these years, she had wondered why he hadn't wanted her, why he had never tried to find her. And now, here he was, telling her that he hadn't even known she was alive. I don't understand, Sophie whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Why didn't she tell you? Richard's eyes filled with sorrow, and he shook his head slowly. I don't know, he said, his voice hoarse. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought I wouldn't want to be involved. But she never gave me the chance to know you. She never told me. Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. All those years, her whole life, she had thought that Richard had chosen to abandon her. She had imagined him as a distant, indifferent man who had decided she wasn't worth keeping. But the truth was far more complicated. He hadn't abandoned her. He had simply never known she existed. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of everything that had been unsaid for so long. Sophie's heart ached with the magnitude of it all. The lost years, the unanswered questions, the deep longing she had carried for so long without ever understanding why. I'm sorry, Richard whispered, his voice filled with pain. I'm so sorry, Sophie. Sophie wiped at the tears that had begun to fall, shaking her head. It's not your fault, she said softly. You didn't know. But I should have known, Richard said, his voice trembling. I should have been there for you. The rawness in his voice made Sophie's chest tighten. She had imagined this moment so many times. What it would be like to tell him, to see his reaction. But she hadn't imagined the grief. She hadn't imagined how much it would hurt to see him broken by the truth. I spent my whole life wondering about you, Sophie said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I thought you didn't want me. Richard's face contorted with pain, and he reached across the desk, his hand trembling as he took hers. I would have wanted you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I would have wanted you more than anything. The weight of his words hit Sophie like a tidal wave, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. For so long, she had lived with the belief that she was unwanted, that her father had chosen to let her go. But now, hearing the anguish in Richard's voice, she realized that she hadn't been abandoned. She had simply been lost, caught in the currents of decisions that had been made long before she had a say. They sat in silence for a long time, their hands clasped tightly together, the distance between them slowly closing as the truth settled around them. Sophie didn't know what the future held. She didn't know how their relationship would move forward, or if Richard would ever truly be able to forgive himself for the years they had lost. But in this moment, sitting across from him, she felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. The door creaked open, breaking the silence, and Sophie looked up to see Grace standing in the doorway, her face ashen and unreadable. She had heard everything. Richard turned to his wife, his expression a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Grace," he began, his voice thick with emotion. But Grace cut him off, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. "So, it's true," she said, her voice cold and bitter. "You have a daughter." Sophie stood up, her body tense. She could feel the hatred radiating from Grace, the silent accusation hanging in the air. "I didn't know," Richard said softly, standing up as well, his gaze pleading. "I swear, I didn't know." Grace's eyes flicked between them, her face hardening as she took a step forward. "It doesn't matter," she hissed. "It's too late for that. You've brought this stranger into our home, into our lives." Sophie's chest tightened, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said quietly, but Grace wasn't listening. "Get out," Grace spat, her voice shaking with rage. "I don't care who you are. You don't belong here." Richard's face crumpled, but before he could respond, Sophie nodded, her heart heavy with resignation. She had hoped, maybe foolishly, that the truth would bring her closer to the family she had never known. But Grace's hatred was a wall that couldn't be broken. Without another word, Sophie turned and walked past Grace, out of the study and down the long, quiet hallway. Sophie walked out of the study, her footsteps heavy on the polished wood floors. Each step felt like she was walking deeper into a fog, the weight of the last few minutes pressing down on her chest. The truth was out. There was no going back now, but instead of feeling relief, Sophie was consumed by the thick, suffocating ache of rejection. The pain in Richard's eyes as he realized what he had missed, and Grace's cold fury, swirled in her mind, a chaotic storm of emotions she couldn't quiet. She passed through the hallway in a daze, barely noticing the luxurious surroundings of the Donovan mansion. The high ceilings, the ornate chandeliers, the pristine furniture. None of it mattered now. This place had never been her home, and after what had just happened, it never would be. Grace's venomous words still echoed in her head. "You don't belong here." The truth was harsh. Sophie had fought for months to carve out a place for herself in this house, to understand her identity, to build a connection with the man who had unknowingly fathered her. But Grace's fury had shattered any illusion Sophie had that this might end well. Sophie wasn't welcome here. Not by Grace, and now, maybe not even by Richard. She reached the grand staircase, her legs weak beneath her as she gripped the banister for support. The ornate railing felt cold under her palm, grounding her for a brief moment as she struggled to process everything. The gravity of her decision weighed heavily on her. She had chosen to tell the truth, to reveal who she really was, but the consequences had spiraled out of her control. A familiar, gentle voice called from behind. "Sophie." Sophie turned slowly to see Richard standing in the hallway, his expression a mixture of pain, confusion, and helplessness. He looked smaller somehow, as if the truth had hollowed him out from the inside. Sophie's heart clenched at the sight of him. This man, who she had imagined as a distant, indifferent figure, was now standing in front of her, torn between the life he had built and the life he had unknowingly abandoned. "Wait," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "Please don't go." Sophie blinked, her emotions flooding to the surface. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Grace doesn't want me here." I don't even know if you do." Richard's face twisted with anguish as he stepped closer, his eyes filled with regret. "Sophie, I had no idea. If I had known about you, I would have." His voice broke, and he struggled to find the words. "I would have been there. I would have done everything differently." Sophie swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "But you didn't know," she said softly. "And now it's too late." "No," Richard said quickly, his voice rising with desperation. "It's not too late. It doesn't have to be. I want to know you, Sophie. I want to be your father." His words hit Sophie with a force she hadn't expected. For months, she had dreamed of this moment, of Richard acknowledging her as his daughter. But now that it was here, the reality of it felt far more complicated. The pain of the years they had lost hung heavy between them, and Grace's anger was a shadow looming over everything. Sophie shook her head, her voice breaking. "What about Grace?" she asked, her chest tightening. "She hates me, Richard. She doesn't want me in your life." Richard hesitated, his face contorting with conflicting emotions. "Grace, she's upset," he admitted, his voice thick with guilt. "But that doesn't mean you have to go. This is my fault, not yours. I should have known." Sophie's heart ached as she watched him struggle. She could see the conflict in his eyes, his loyalty to Grace, the life they had built together, and the guilt that was tearing him apart now that he knew the truth. But as much as Sophie wanted to believe that they could somehow make this work, she knew it wasn't that simple. "She'll never accept me," Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've seen the way she looks at me. She'll never let me be a part of your life." Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the words seemed to die in his throat. He glanced back toward the study, where Grace still stood, fuming with rage. For a moment, he looked utterly defeated, as if he knew deep down that Sophie was right. Grace's hatred wasn't something that could be easily overcome. Sophie's chest tightened as she realized what she had to do. She had wanted so badly to find a place in this family, to build a connection with Richard, but now she saw the truth. She couldn't stay here. Not like this. The house, the life Richard had built with Grace. It wasn't her world. It never had been. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at Richard, her voice breaking. "I think it's better if I leave." Richard's face fell, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Sophie, please, don't." But Sophie shook her head, her heart heavy with grief. "I don't belong here," she said softly, echoing Grace's words. But this time they felt true. "I can't stay, Richard. Not when everything is falling apart." For a long moment, Richard didn't speak. He stood there, staring at her with helpless eyes, torn between his desire to know her and the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not after I've just found you." Sophie's tears finally spilled over, her chest aching with the weight of his words. She wanted to stay. She wanted to build something with him. But the reality of their situation made it impossible. Too much had been lost, and now, too much was at risk. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." Richard stepped forward, his hands trembling as he reached out and gently pulled Sophie into an embrace. She stiffened for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. But then she melted into his arms, the tears streaming down her face. It was the first time they had truly touched, father and daughter, and the weight of it broke something deep inside Sophie. For a few long seconds, they held each other, the unspoken grief of lost years hanging between them. Sophie's heart ached with the knowledge that this moment, this fragile connection, might be all they would ever have. She wanted to hold on forever, to freeze this moment in time, but she knew it couldn't last. Finally, Sophie pulled away, wiping at her tear-streaked face. "I'll be okay," she said, trying to reassure both of them, though her voice trembled. Richard nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." Sophie gave him a sad smile. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You didn't know. And now, we both have to find a way to move forward." Richard looked at her, his face a mask of pain. "You'll always have a place with me, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what happens." Sophie nodded, her heart breaking all over again. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She wanted to believe him, but she knew that her leaving was inevitable. With one last, tearful glance, Sophie turned and walked toward the door. The house felt impossibly large and empty as she made her way down the grand staircase for what felt like the last time. The weight of everything she had lost, everything she had never truly had, pressed down on her as she stepped out into the cold, crisp air of the night. She paused at the front steps, her breath visible in the chill, and looked up at the Donovan mansion one last time. This house had been a mystery to her for so long, a place where she thought she might find answers. But now, as she stood outside, she realized that it wasn't the answers she needed. It was peace. With a heavy heart, Sophie turned and walked away, leaving behind the family she had always dreamed of knowing, but could never truly be part of. Sophie stood at the edge of the sidewalk, her breath forming small clouds in the chilly night air. The grand Donovan mansion loomed behind her, its lights glowing softly against the backdrop of the city. The place that had held so much mystery, so many hopes for answers, now felt like a closed chapter. As she turned her back on the house for what she knew might be the last time, a weight lifted from her shoulders, but another settled deep in her chest. The connection she had longed for, the family she had spent months trying to be a part of, it was gone. Sophie had left it all behind, but in its place was the painful reality she had to face. Sometimes, no matter how much you want to belong, the past is too complicated, too broken to fix. She walked down the quiet street, her footsteps echoing softly in the night. Her heart ached, heavy with the memory of Richard's embrace, the tears in his eyes as he whispered, "You'll always have a place with me." His words had touched her deeply, but Sophie knew that place couldn't be here. Not now. Not when the wounds were so fresh, not with Grace's resentment looming over them. She found herself at a small park not far from the mansion, the playground empty, the swings gently swaying in the cold breeze. Sophie sat down on a bench, pulling her coat tighter around her as she stared up at the night sky. The stars were bright, distant, and untouchable, just like the life she had dreamed of with Richard. For a long time, Sophie sat in silence, letting the emotions of the night wash over her. The tears came slowly at first, then in waves, her chest heaving as she finally let herself mourn everything she had lost. The father she had never known, the family she had imagined, the possibility of a future that could have been different. It wasn't just the rejection from Grace that hurt. It was the realization that nothing would ever be the way she had hoped. But as the tears subsided, Sophie felt a strange calm settle over her. She had spent so long searching for answers, for the truth, but now that it was out, she realized something important. Her life wasn't defined by the Donovan name. She wasn't defined by the family she had never known, nor by the secrets that had been kept from her. She had come here seeking closure, and though it hadn't come in the way she expected, it was still there, quietly waiting beneath the pain. She had found her father, and while their relationship was fractured, there had been a moment, brief, but real, where they had connected. Richard knew who she was now, and in his own way, he had accepted her. That was something. But Sophie also knew that acceptance wasn't enough to heal the rift between them. Grace would never allow her to be part of their lives, and Sophie didn't want to force herself into a family that was so divided. She needed to let go. She needed to move on, for her own sake. Taking a deep breath, Sophie stood from the bench, her body feeling lighter now. She looked around the park, the empty swings and slides, and felt a small smile tug at her lips. There was a strange beauty in the stillness of the night, a kind of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She wiped the last of her tears away and started walking, her steps slow but deliberate. Days passed, and the Donovan mansion grew more distant, not just physically but emotionally. Sophie had moved back into her small apartment, returning to the life she had put on hold when she became consumed with finding her father. Her textbooks and medical notes lay scattered on her desk, and for the first time in weeks, she found herself able to focus on them again. The chaos in her mind had finally quieted, replaced by a sense of clarity. One afternoon, as she sat in the campus library, reviewing notes for an upcoming exam, her phone buzzed. Sophie glanced at the screen and froze. It was Richard. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering over the phone. Part of her wanted to let it ring, to leave things as they were and avoid reopening the wounds of their last encounter. But another part of her, a part that still longed for connection, couldn't ignore the call. With a deep breath, she answered, "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, then Richard's familiar voice, soft and tentative. "Sophie, I hope it's okay that I called." Sophie swallowed, her heart pounding. "It's fine," she replied quietly. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," Richard said, his voice heavy with emotion, "about what you told me, and about how I handled things." Sophie closed her eyes, her heart aching at the sound of his regret. "It wasn't your fault, Richard. I know," he said, his voice thick with pain. "But I also know I wasn't there for you when you needed me most. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Sophie's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You didn't know," she repeated, the same words she had said that night. "You can't blame yourself for something you didn't even know existed." There was a long pause on the other end, and Sophie could hear Richard take a shaky breath. "I don't want this to be the end, Sophie," he said, his voice raw. "I don't want to lose you again. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Sophie's heart clenched. She had hoped for this, dreamed of it. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure how to respond. The wounds were still fresh, the scars of their complicated past not yet fully healed. But she could hear the sincerity in Richard's voice, the pain of a man who had lost so much and wanted to make things right. "I don't know what that looks like," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't know how we move forward from here." "We'll figure it out," Richard said, his tone filled with quiet determination. "One step at a time. If you're willing to try." Sophie sat in silence for a moment, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She had spent so long searching for this connection, and now that it was within reach, she was terrified of what it might mean. But as she thought about everything she had been through, everything she had learned, she realized that she didn't have to have all the answers right now. Maybe it wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building something new. "I'm willing to try," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end, and Sophie could almost hear the relief in Richard's breath. "Thank you," he whispered. After they said their goodbyes, Sophie sat back in her chair, staring out the library window at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. She felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, a feeling of hope that she hadn't expected. The road ahead was uncertain, but it wasn't blocked. She and Richard would take things slowly, one step at a time. They would navigate this new relationship, no longer strangers, but not yet fully family. Not yet, but there was time. Time to heal, time to grow, time to figure out what their future might look like. Sophie closed her eyes and let herself breathe, knowing that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not a place in someone else's life, but the strength to create her own.